Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to ask you all to give yourself a round of applause for arriving at the #1 discussion forum at the Global Landscapes Forum in Bonn 2018. My name's Christopher Keddle, and I'm a science domain leader in forest genetic resources and restoration at Biodiversity International. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. This session is really about delivering a diverse and suitable seed and planting material as a key barrier to sustainable landscape restoration. This is really about how we can generate the volume of seeds needed for restoring and meeting the pledges, so moving from pledges to impact as part of the GLF program. We have a packed schedule. We have a fantastic panel, which I'll introduce later. We're splitting the session up into 3 topics. First of all, we will have an introduction from Vincent Gitz, who's the director of the FTA, Forest, Trees and Agroforestry program at the CGIAR, followed by a keynote by Lars Graudal. I struggle with names. This is one of my limitations as a moderator. And then we will bring on the panel to have a very dynamic and I think interactive panel discussion, which we will then engage you with, followed by 2 further keynote presentations, really bringing to your eyes some of the solutions that are being presented by researchers from the CGIAR, particularly within the FTA program from Biodiversity International, and ICRAF from Marius Ekwe and Ramni Jamnadaz, followed by an additional interventions from the panel, and then an open forum where we will invite you really to bring your perspectives and to contribute. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Vincent Gitz from the Forest, Trees and Agroforestry Program Director of CGIAR to give a few opening words.
Thank you, Christopher, and once again, good morning. Good morning to all. Restoration is one of the priorities of a research program such as FTA, and as we know, there are considerable ambitions in terms of restoration, both through the Bonn Challenge, but also through the NDCs, the National Determined Contribution for Climate Change. And we organized last August with our partners, C4, ICRAF, Biodiversity, CGIAR, Tropenbos, a reflection on what are the main difficulties, the main constraints to upscale restoration. And one of the barriers for delivering that is the delivery of delivery systems at scales for diverse, adapted and high quality native tree seeds and planting materials. And the success of restoration projects and afforestation projects can be jeopardized by the lack of attention to the quality of planting materials. So this point is sometimes neglected in restoration projects. We have identified that there is sometimes a low awareness about this issue. Some studies that we've done last year have precisely documented that the delivery of appropriate tree germplasm in quality and quantity is not necessarily properly addressed. For example, a review of afforestation and reforestation projects from Africa, Asia, and Latin America that we've conducted showed that there was a discrepancy between the trees projected to be planted and the availability of germplasm. Often the species that are proposed are suitable, appropriate for the specific situation, but they are simply not available. And also another review that was led by Biodiversity of close to 140 projects worldwide identified several problems in terms of availability and diversity of tree seeds, and the consequences of that is that the restored tree population may not just be sustainable, productive, and persist over the long term. So what does that show? That shows that projects for restoration and afforestation, reforestation need to integrate the availability of good tree planting material as one of the major concerns, from the design to the implementation. And the purpose of this event today is threefold. First, to raise awareness of this issue here and also beyond the GLF. It's not that easy to grow trees. You need to have the right seeds, the right seedlings of good quality, and for that you need organizations and you need infrastructures. Second, we want to explore ways to address this issue, listen from experiences on the ground, what has worked and what has less worked, or what has failed and what. And then look with the range of actors here in this room whether we can devise practical solutions that can be upscaled. And one of our objectives here today in putting a major topic, which may appear a bit technical, is that it also one that enables to, and also necessitates, we think, to bring together a wide range of actors, civil society, private sector, public sector, international sector. And that is also why we hope we can have a lively discussion, not only with the panel, but also with the floor. And so to say, I'll hand over to our colleague from Biodiversity and FTA, Christopher Kettle, to moderate the rest of the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. So I'd like to first ask Lars Grauder from ICRAF and the University of Copenhagen to give the first keynote. Lars is going to talk for about 5 minutes, and I'll just hand over to Lars.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this discussion forum, which, as you have heard, is about whether reproductive material of trees constitute a barrier for landscape restoration. I will give you a quick introduction to the context, to the global context of this challenge. How do I get the next slide? Okay. You're probably all familiar with the Bonn challenge in this room. The slide up here shows a news feature that was brought in Nature in August. And this is actually the largest restoration effort in history. I think that's worth repeating. The largest restoration effort in history. And it's not just the Bonn challenge, it's actually backed by our 3 conventions and their various targets and some of the Sustainable Development Goals. One thing is to have a plan, another is to get it implemented. We are now at commitments of almost 170 million hectares, so one would say that we are probably well underway. The basic requirements are land, labor, tenure, capital, and other inputs. The land is there, and the labor is there. Tenure always poses a problem, but one can say that with the commitments, at least the political will seem to be there. In terms of capital, we are short of investments, but we also have to acknowledge that public support for this plan has actually never been greater, both in terms of support from bilateral donors and from multilateral organizations and from the countries that have provided the commitments. So there is some reason to be optimistic. The last basic requirement on other inputs, which is really the subject, I'll come back to shortly. On the benefits, they are written with small text in contrast to their importance. So what does that mean? We know that land use change and the land sink is really important for the carbon balance. And we have seen studies coming out showing that natural climate solutions, which mainly are tree-based restoration, can provide for mitigation of 1/3 of the problem if we are to reach the Paris Agreement. I think that's also worth repeating. 1/3 of the problem could be solved. An easy question here is to say, why not just triple the effort? The land is there. It may not be that easy, but nevertheless, why not ask the question? In particular, when you go deeper into the benefits and realize that it creates economic value, it has positive correlations with biodiversity conservation, resilience, and with agricultural produce, and even dietary diversity. So, why are investments not pouring in? Now to the last of the basic requirements that is the subject of today. Vincent has actually already mentioned these two studies that came out earlier this year. So I don't need to explain them in any detail, but they confirm that the use of reproductive material is a major bottleneck for appropriate restoration. And what most people may not know is that by actually applying this, one could enhance the benefits of the natural climate solutions that we've been talking about, maybe even double them. The major bottlenecks are both on the input supply side, where there is an insufficient production of the material that is needed. There's also insufficient extension of the know-how. And the bottleneck is also on the demand side, where the awareness of the benefits that one can get is not really there. The knowledge that we are able to close the yield gap and even enhance production further is just not around. Restoration requires diversity. Vincent also mentioned the need to focus on many species. We have another problem here, and that is that this resource that we actually depend on for restoration is quickly diminishing, as fast as we have never seen it before. So, in summary, we have the challenges of actually mobilizing this diversity before it disappears, making it available in demand, and focusing on programs that actually deal with many species. We have to get away from the idea that we can only work on a few of those. And we need to link that in conservation, breeding, and delivery programs. And on delivery, to achieve efficient programs, the most important thing is probably to empower the users. So they need to know what is actually best for them, how they can get it, and that they actually can get it. There was a newspaper article in the East African last week. This was about agricultural seed, but nevertheless, it provides the gist of the problem, in the sense that a lot of the seed delivered, sold, or provided is not what it's supposed to be, for many reasons. And I will leave this short newspaper quote on the screen. What would it take to resolve this situation with respect to landscape restoration? A quick economic calculation at the dimensions of the African Forest Restoration Initiative of 100 million hectares shows that the investment needed is actually small. We are talking about $1 a hectare. And the benefits will be hundredfolds. So this is actually where I want to end, and hope that the discussion we are going to have today will take us a bit further with respect to the practical implementation of some of these things. Thank you.
Lars, why don't you sit down and they can take a seat there. Thank you very much, Lars. I'd like to ask our panelists to please join us on stage now as we go on to have a discussion about really what are the situations on the ground in some of the countries and regions where the Bonn challenges are being implemented. And so if our panelists would like to now join us on stage. we made some effort in really trying to gather together a diverse panel which included not only people with the technical background and understanding of what these challenges are in the regions and countries where they work, but also bringing people that would bring different perspectives both from the business sector as well as from different youth generation perspective as well. So we're trying to really bring a dynamic component to the discussion rather than a very specific technical address. I'd like to start by really asking the panelists, particularly from a regional perspective, how they feel the ability to deliver diverse and quality seed and planting material is impeding their ability to meet their pledges in terms of the Bonn challenges. And I'd first like to address this to Anase Ngongomi from Cameroon, who is leading leading the program on monitoring of regeneration and restoration, and also the focal point of Africa 100 for Cameroon, working in the Ministry of Forests and Wildlife. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
So each panelist will only have 3 minutes to address this. So this is we're trying to keep this very dynamic and interactive.
Yeah. Yeah. Here. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chris, for giving me the floor. Just to remind the fact that Cameroon has committed to restore by 12 million degraded landscape areas and to reduce by 32% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So these support to take very strong action in terms of reforestation, in terms of forest regeneration. And we think that seed value chain is very important to start with a very strong reforestation program. So we are working on, and we start with implementing our new reforestation program next year. Thank you.
I'd now like to ask Musa Ndorango, thank you, Musa, who is the Director General of the Seed and Forest Center in Burkina Faso, to give his perspective from Burkina Faso.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Musa Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is a silent country, and we are committed to plant 5 million hectares by 2030. And for the country, we are the silent country, and everybody knows that in the Sahel we don't have enough rain. The rainfall is decreasing, but especially this year, we have a particular year because the rainfall is good for farmers in the Sahel this year, particularly in Burkina Faso. And we have also the main constraint that we have there is we have a combined conflict with the effect of natural degradation. The degradation is due to natural situation like the rainfall degradation and the climate change. And we have also humans who are influencing a lot the forest by cutting, by fire, by removing with the firewood system in agriculture. And also we have an annual decrease of the forest. It's around 10,000 hectares per year, it's estimated. And if you see also the planting system, we are planting a lot, around 10 million trees, but we have around 30% or 35% of survival. That means that we are planting, but the remaining plants after 1 year is around 30%. And also we have the situation also is we have also many native species which are now decreasing. We don't have, they are affected by they are threatened by extinction in Burkina Faso. This is the situation that I can raise to the forum now.
Thank you very much, Musa. I'd now like to ask Charles Karangan, who is the Regional Technical Coordinator of Forest and Landscapes and Livelihoods for Rwanda in IUCN, to give his perspective.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I think this is a big question, Chris, because the tree seed diversity obviously drives or determines how much we can quickly achieve these big, ambitious targets. If not, we can't actually achieve restoration. That brings multiple benefits for people and the planet we are talking about. For a couple of reasons. When I started my job with IUCN, I met with the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources in Rwanda, and they asked me, Charles, and remember, I'm not a tree seed scientist, I'm an economist and a policy by training. And he asked me a question, do you think we can start reducing eucalyptus in this country? And I'm a Rwandan, so I knew what it means for farmers, for biodiversity, and etc. And I said, yeah, if you want it as a policy and decision maker, yes, it's possible. And remember, Rwanda as a country made a commitment to restore 2 million hectares out of only 2.6 million, our total land area. So it's a border-to-border restoration. 89% of the country is monoculture, so eucalyptus basically. We have 69 eucalyptus species across the country. You won't see any other species. You will just see eucalyptus all over the places, and it's affecting, of course, the land, productivity, etc. And the farmers already feel like actually trees are competing with our crops because of the quality and the type of trees we are telling them to plant. As a result, obviously, when you go out, farmers know the importance of the trees on farm, but they actually feel like because there's no diversity, it's competing with our crops. And the motivation starts reducing. So I think tree seeds diversity is very important, is of paramount if we want to achieve this. But of course, it takes a lot of thinking to achieve that. The other parameter I wanted to bring as I speak in my 3 minutes is actually institutional framework. And when I asked the minister that question, I actually realized, yes, eucalyptus, yeah, we need research, but who does research on trees? Minister of Agriculture looks for crops and type research, obviously. But actually, we realized for the last more than 15, 25 years, there was no focus on tree seed research. There was a focus on crops because food security, etc. But there was no specific dedication on tree seed research. And that's obviously, you see what it means. There was no new species, etc. ICRAF was the only institution trying to push hard to do research on trees, but also we're taken again on crops. So there's a whole institutional issue there. And I think if we have to achieve this, we need to get this right as well. I will probably talk later about that.
Yes, that's great, Charles. Thank you. I'd like to next introduce Vania Olmos-Lau, who is Mexican and also a youth landscape initiative member of the Global Landscapes Forum, who's going to give some perspectives from Mexico and Peru.
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to thank you for including youth, because as we know, it is our shared future, and whether we achieve the challenge or not is very important to us. So I will just briefly exemplify the barriers I have seen in 2 underground projects where I've had experience. The first has to do with lack of knowledge and access, and the second one has to do with bureaucracy getting in the way. The first example is in Paraguay, where thanks to international funding, there is a productive agroforestry restoration project with yerba mate. So here, international funding facilitated that local landowners could have access to seedlings to restore their land with yerba mate. The problem for this to scale up is that once this international funding was over, farmers don't have the know-how on how to germinate yerba mate seeds. Even though the yerba mate is naturally present in their forest, it is a very difficult plant to germinate, and they don't know how to do this. So because there wasn't a focus on teaching them or building capacity on how to germinate wild seeds, that is why this project, without international funding, can't scale up. As well, farmers don't have the financial means to access seedlings if they would like to. The second example is in Mexico. In Mexico, we do have an appropriate system for restoration, and the government pays local communities to restore their landscape. So this is done well. And as well, we have a regionalized system. So seeds from trees in a region cannot be planted in another region. So this is done well. But if you've ever been to Mexico, you've seen we have a lot of mountains. So climate and soil change very quickly. Even though it's regionalized, we need to be more local. So let me just go back to this. Yeah. So even though there is a government finance for this and it is regionalized and the labor is available, people do want to work on restoration. The problem here is that, and local communities do have the enthusiasm. They started noticing that the seedlings brought to them by government institutions were not the most appropriate for their land. They would see the trees, some of the trees die with time, so they started to have the initiative to have their own nurseries. And here is where bureaucracy comes in as a problem. Because when the government does these restoration programs, the only seedlings they can legally provide are the ones from certified nurseries. And the certified nurseries need to produce a certain amount of trees a year, and they need to have certain, things to be certified. And it is very hard for local communities to access this certification. So even though they want and they have the know-how on how to germinate the seeds from the trees in their land, they cannot use the seedlings to restore their land. And finally, I would just like to leave the question that thinking about climate change, even if you have the right seedlings, where do you plant them? In a case of a mountainous country like Mexico, because we can see the tree line is going up, so the distribution of trees is changing. So if I plant a tree now, and in 10 years the climate is going to be different, then how should we tackle this?
Thank you, Vanya. So next I'd like to bring a slightly different perspective here in terms of inviting Doreen, I'll see if I can get this right, Mashu, who is from Zimbabwe and has just recently finished an MBA at MIT with a certificate in sustainability, and is a social entrepreneur and founder of The Good Heritage, and also has an extensive background working in the finance industry and business sector as a mergers and acquisitions advisor for PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, Doreen.
Thanks, Chris. So, I think, from what I've heard, for me, I think what's missing is really connecting restoration efforts to economic activity. And obviously I'm coming from a business angle, but I think that thanks to the SDGs, a lot of companies are now thinking about doing good, not in addition to actually making financial returns. And there's some research that's been published about connecting companies that do good, connecting financial returns to companies that do good and think about the society as a whole and not just their main business agenda. So I think using business as a vehicle for restoration is something that we need to start looking at, both from us, the business people, but also the scientists and the researchers supporting that. So I think we'll talk more about it, but I think that's what the missing link is for me.
Great. Thanks, Doreen. So finally, I'd like to ask Doug Maguire, who's the director of the Forest Landscape and Restoration Mechanism of FAO, to give a bit of a more general perspective from the FAO on these issues of delivery for scaling up and meeting the pledges.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thanks to Biodiversity, ECRAF, C4, FTA for actually putting this event on, because I think it's really important. It's a topic that we sort of all know is there, but we really don't pay enough attention to it. And it's critical. And one of the concerns I have is, you know, when we see the presentation that Lars made, the ambition is huge. And 350 million hectares now to restore or to have under restoration by 2030 is not an insignificant amount of land and activities that will be required. And I think we need to be careful, because there's a tendency at times, you know, we were on 2020, now we're at 2030, but there's a tendency to really try to move fast, because these are time-bound targets, and there's a risk in taking shortcuts. And we're seeing that, I think, in some countries, because you know, if we're going to live up to that political commitment that's been made, we need to move fast. And moving fast means perhaps not taking the time to really understand the science, the practical issues. You know, trees have been planted for centuries, and nursery operations have been underway for just as long. And we know how to grow trees, we know how to plant trees, but success rates are not always as high as we would like. The planting material is often not what it should be. So there are technical issues that need to be addressed. But I think we also need to be able to understand, what are we trying to achieve through this restoration? And the problem I see right now is that we still are a little bit stuck on the physical targets. How many hectares are we going to restore? For what purpose? Is this for biophysical? Is this for economic, for ecosystem services provision? Is it for livelihood development? Is it for food security? And until we really hone in on those questions, we may not be looking at the front end well enough in terms of what do we need to plant and what purpose is it going to serve. So that sort of rush to go out and restore these vast areas of land has a risk. So I think we need to be careful, and we need to address that. There are a lot of issues with respect to capacity in countries that is very uneven. A country like Burkina Faso has had, I think, a well-known good seed center for a long time. It's a model for a number of countries in Africa, but you don't have that same support and capacity in every country. So how do we make sure that you have that capacity built to the adequate level? And not only from the forestry sector, because the objectives are multiple objectives in many cases. Are we sure, as Charles was saying, that the institutional setting is the right one? Do we have ministries of agriculture involved adequately? Because this is not only about forest restoration or planting trees for forests, it's also about trees on farmlands, cropping systems, agroforestry. So that has to be sorted out as well. And I see a lot of new projects that are beginning, a huge momentum now, politically and financially, but we haven't really addressed that issue of what do we do about the planting material. That's a huge, huge issue. So I think, as Doreen also alluded to, the role of the private sector and the embedding restoration in economic realities is very, very important. Public funding and sort of classical project funding is only going to go so far. The role of private sector we see as potentially being huge, but that also has a whole new set of questions about you know, what is going to be of economic value, and how do we make sure that we're not simply bringing in exotics that are going to be fast growing, perhaps giving the fastest return, but really focusing on native species and the work that Biodiversity and others have been carrying out to make sure that that gets incorporated. So those are just some of the issues that I think we really need to be trying to sort out in a much more effective way.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody, for that. And managing to keep very nicely towards the time that we still have good time for questions on this particular component. So I'd like to open the floor now. If anyone would like to have any questions of clarification on this particular point, or very short interventions, if you would like to intervene, I'd like to ask the female members of the audience first if they would like to intervene at this point. And put your hand up for the microphone, and it will come round to you. So if anyone would like to intervene and make a question. Yes, okay. Microphone, do we have someone bringing the microphone? Thank you very much. Can you please say, state your name and your organization?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Prem. I come from Nepal. I want to relate some of your remarks. Thank you. I come from in your economic term, I come from middle-class family, poor country. But I assure that we are very rich in culture, biodiversity, and trees. But in economic term, we are a very poor country in the world. I heard your remarks that farmers don't know how to grow trees. There are problems of finance and all these things, and we must know this. Farmers should know this. There are a lot of should know, must know kind of recommendations. But as a poor farmer of a poor mountainous country, I want to assure you with that we know how to grow trees, We know the importance of tree diversity, seed diversity, because tree diversity and seed diversity is not restoration only for us. It is linked to our culture, our belief. What we need at the moment as a poor farmer, we need a science, what to grow. The second, we need a market. If I plant, you can tell me, in a scientific term, I'm a smallholder. I have a small piece of land where I need to grow rice for my child, but at the same time, I want to grow some trees. For that, I need a market where I can sell my trees or timber after 20 years. So I would like to this forum to focus much on the science. Sure. We have traditional science, but we need also some modern science, modern technology, some genetically improved varieties and so on, and also the market. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other, one very brief intervention at this point then, because we want to keep this short.
Thank you. I'm Lampard from Kenya. Just going back to the discussion of restoration, and when we look at this restoration, we are trying to bring back life maybe to ecosystems that got degraded or destroyed by anthropogenic activities, whereby people or society chose to get extract maybe resources from the natural ecosystem, ending up destroying it. But my question is, what should we, how do you view, or what should we have some initiative for the communities and people who already chose to keep these ecosystems? You see, there is an opportunity cost. If I'm not extracting from the forest, then I'm keeping the forest for the betterment of Mother Nature. But what are we focusing on when we look at such kind of communities that have chosen to keep these natural resources for nature and for us as a global society? Because we might put more effort and energy only on looking at areas that have been destroyed, and then forgetting that there are people who chose deliberately to keep these natural ecosystems intact, and that is helping the world. So do we have some sort of initiatives also that to motivate them and don't show that they need to extract from the natural ecosystem so that to survive? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask you to hold off any more interventions now, because the purpose of this first part was to very much frame the problem in the way, and I think we've done that very well. We've shown that there's a major issue here in being able to deliver that diversity, and that diversity is fundamental to not only the resilience of restoration, but also in providing the opportunities from the business perspective as well, and reducing that competition between restoration and other land uses by making restoration part of a productive solution. I'd like to now ask Marius Ekwe from Biodiversity to come up and give the next short keynote, which is going to start to get us thinking about what are the possible solutions to some of these issues, and then we'll be followed by Ramni.
How to move?
To change the slides, how do we do it?
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I will talk to you about some solutions that Biodiversity International are working on to solve those issues. So we have our so-called Tree for Seed initiatives, which has 3 components. The first one is about identifying and trying to safeguard the genetic diversity, the diversity of trees that are used in restoration. And this involves the use of new technology, mostly remote sensing, species distribution, mapping, threat mapping, climate change modeling, also mapping the diversity of trees, really to identify the diversity of the different tree species, and also the suitable habitat. And combining all of those information, we identify the right population and where we should conserve them. And those are locations where we can now go to collect seed and other reproductive material to deliver for the restoration activity. So this is the first component about identifying and safeguarding the genetic diversity. And I forget to mention, because trees don't have borders, so we are working within a network. So in Africa, we call it SAFORGEN, the Sub-Saharan African Forest Genetic Resource Network. We have similar network in Asia called APFORGEN, and in Latin America it's called LAPFORGEN. The second thing is we are working on some decision support tool to help a restoration practitioner to select the right species for the right place and for the right goal. So the tool was pioneered by my colleague Evert here in Colombia, and we are now trying to do it in other countries. So it's how it works is when you have a particular area where you want to do your restoration, you just need to add the coordinates. And then, of course, put the objective of your restoration, how many species you would like to plant. And then the tool will bring to you some solution with a list of species, give to you some maps about the distribution of the species, seed zone, about seed zone, from where you can move your material, and even if give to you information about propagation protocols. So we try to capture all of those information in the same tool to help practitioners really to make a decision very quickly in the field. This is the second component of the Tree for Seed initiative. The third one is once we have identified those gene conservation units, and then we are able to help the restoration practitioner to select the right species for the place where he wants to restore. We need now some technology to really develop, to scale, to develop this at scale. And this is come to the delivering of the material, what we call the seeded technology. But again, here we need first to know, understand how the seed system works in each country. And we have done this work in some countries in Latin America. So we basically work with different agencies through some questionnaire and collect information to understand how the seed system is working in the country, and try to rank with some criteria like what are the enabling environments, how seed are harvested and produced and distributed, are there some measures to control the quality of material, and what are also the question about the market access and demand. So we need to understand really the situation. And once we have this information, to deliver now this technology at scale, we are also working on the use of mobile apps technology, really to link the market and the demand. So we should be able to trace, the species or any seed done to the trees where it was collected, how it was produced, what are the distribution channels until going to the users. So those are the three solutions we are working on at Biodiversity. So just to summarize, our initiative is really to safeguard the diversity, which is a foundation of a resilient restoration. The second one is to provide the technology and tools to deliver those objectives at scale. And the third one is, and also to build capacity, And the last one is really to use the power of a new technology really to deliver it at scale. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize, I didn't introduce Marius. Marius Ekwe is leading the Forest Genetic Resource Unit in Cameroon for biodiversity. So, I'd next like to invite Ramni Jamnadas, who's head of the Tree Genetics Unit at ICRAF, and also the flagship leader of tree genetic resources for the Forest Trees and Agroforestry program at CGIAR.
Thank you, Chris. I will want my presentation. I feel the panel's already given my presentation, so I can go and sit. Okay, so following up from what Lars Graudal said about the quality of planting material, as did everyone else here, they brought it up. I feel that we also need to be thinking about the quality of restoration. And like Marius alluded to, the right trees for the right place and for the right purpose. Are we looking at trees just for restoration, just for the sake of restoration? Or are we really targeting certain products or certain services, or both, the livelihood benefits, the environmental benefits? Is it as simple as ABC? I don't think so, as Doug mentioned. It isn't. It isn't as, who is evaluating the performance of restoration? Who's collecting all that information, the data that is required to know the impact of everyone? Everyone jumped on the bandwagon. I think there are huge issues here, so beyond what we're all trying to do. Yes. Okay, how do we move? The green one. This is interesting. Where do I point?
No, here.
Yep. Yeah. All right. It's got many things. It won't work.
It's not changing?
No. Ah, now it has. So I won't spend too much time, or I don't have too much time, on this slide here, which actually shows some of the tools ICRAF has also developed within the framework of FTA as well. There are decision support tools. There is the Useful Trees for Africa, where you can pick up what indigenous species grow where in the whole of Africa. My colleague Roland Kind is one of the key persons to develop that. There's then the more expanded version of that for 8 countries in East Africa called the Vegetation Map for Africa, linked to smartphone versions and linked to the Agroforestry Species Board, one-stop shop for information on plant species. This database is actually linked to now 43 databases which can pick up the maximum information one can for each of the species. Is that enough? You will have to tell us. But we all have guidelines, know-how for practice in different languages. I think among all the institutes represented here, we're all trying to do the same thing. So just to give you examples of what World Agroforestry Center, how is it trying to achieve its restoration agenda and its restoration objectives? We try to expand the conservation aspect of it. I mean, there are many Africans in this group. I'm an African too. I wonder if you know how many food tree species there are on our continent. We don't have time, but 800. And in my markets, I will only see 4 or 5. West Africa, I'm from East Africa, West Africa, a few more. What's going to happen with all those species? And Lars mentioned almost 40 to 50% of them are disappearing, are threatened. We need to expand our field gene banks, especially for recalcitrant species. Most of them are food trees. There is funding. Actually, GIZ is a great supporter of here, and I saw a GIZ gentleman around. But the funding is not enough, and it is shrinking, because we are told, no, you need to show use for these species. Use for tree species instantly, really. So let me just show you this very quickly. I extracted, if you look at the rightmost graph up there, that is actually, those are 20-year export value time series for 5 formerly bred tree commodity crops. And the data indicate high increasing values, justifying improvement. Our trees are wild. Most African trees, Asian trees are wild. Many of them are wild. They need investments for improvement, for domestication. ICRAF has been involved in tree domestication, about 160 odd trees, all at different levels of domestication. Very few have really made it to the market because the investments, they need to be more investments. They just haven't been enough. We're working with trees, not with millet or not with maize. Just to give you an example of one crop where I have been involved is Allen Blackia, which finally made to the markets in France and Sweden last year. And it's still wild harvested, but the business case was developed because we showed, yes, you can domesticate it. The tree grew that big, it got two big fruits, and it collapsed because it couldn't handle it. But the approach works, so they were willing to put it in there. And it's, try it, I hear it's a very good margarine. But I think what we find in our experience is very attractive to donors is putting food trees back into landscape through the restoration, using the restoration agenda. And Stephen McMullen, who has been working with food tree portfolios, actually developing a portfolio of trees which would support the annual crops, especially the hunger periods in Africa, to support, and those trees that will fruit during the hunger periods. And so you can see in the graph here that actually she's trying to address the nutrition objectives. Which tree fruits have got high vitamin A, vitamin C, and other nutrients. This is very popular with our donors, and they do want more. And currently, she has already developed 10 portfolios, which are in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. But I am a little worried about this as well, because farmers want trees that have markets. They want to eat a bit, but most of it they want to sell. And that brings us to value chains. Really, as Doreen said, we do need to invest in value chains. And it is going to be a long-term investment. So this is my final slide, really. I think an ideal situation for us is in this proposal, a project actually led by Lars, on adequate tree supply, tree seed portfolios in Ethiopia called PATSPO, where Ethiopian government has made a commitment of 15 million to restore 15 million hectares. And they realize this is going to take time. And NICFI, the Norwegian government, the aid, realize this needs time. And this is where we are establishing our infrastructure for seed and seedlings, 150 species, breeding seed orchards for future and for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramni. You can take a seat there, Ramni. Thank you very much, Ramni. I'd like to now turn back to our panel, and we are moving through the time very quickly, so I'm going to have to remind them that we have very limited time to respond to this, because I really want to allow time for audience participation, which is really one of the key points. So I'll start with Charles. Perhaps you'd like to give some interventions in relation to the solutions that have been proposed.
Thank you very much. I think this is amazing. And it makes me think about what the gentleman from Nepal said. Farmer knows probably more than this as well. And we need to take that into consideration. So I have a couple of points maybe as I close. I think we are aware that the demand is probably higher now than the supply. And the demand translates from knowledge to practice. We need, therefore, to invest strongly in knowledge. Things are changing. Climate change is a reality. We need to invest in science and knowledge for the tree seed diversity. The second point is institutional framework. The tree seed is different from crops, and we need the right framework for that. Most of the time, Ministry of Environment deals with trees, forest, Ministry of Agriculture deals with the crops, and the science, the research on trees is left to some of the partners, ICRAF and other CGIAR members. But we need to learn from Burkina Faso, investment that the country has put in tree seed research and knowledge. Number three, the private sector is something we keep neglecting. We just completed the seed supply chain for Rwanda. And surprisingly, the private sector, small, medium entrepreneurs, are actually not in the system, in the supply chain. How do we incentivize or create a framework that can track that? The last is collaboration and coordination between different partners and actors, because we are talking about the same things. But actually, we are working in silos, which confuse farmers and confuse partners and confuse governments. And look at all of these tools, for example. In the same country, you have probably 10 partners doing the same, probably same work. Why can't we come on the table and talk to our partners and our beneficiaries? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Doreen, do you like to?
Sure. I think, I'll just underscore a few things that, we mentioned earlier, but also I think starting with harnessing local knowledge, because even as a business, as an entrepreneur, when I started, I realized that there's a lot of knowledge that is within the communities, that is being held in the communities, and sometimes we try to bring solutions to them, but they have the solutions. So when we go there, I realized I had to kind of step back and say, okay, what are you already doing? Like, just to give a bit of background, I'm using non-timber forest resources, creating products and trying to commercialize them, right? But I had to start from, is there a demand for what I'm trying to do? So if I look at the forest, what demands out there, what problem can I solve with it, or what demands can I meet with it? And one of the biggest demands I see now is wellness, which is a big trend everywhere in the world. So we can meet a wellness need using some forest products. So if I connect those two and I'm able to show the community the benefit of growing trees and planting trees and not tell them what can be and build castles in the air, then I get more of a collaboration that way and a co-creation of some sort, because I come with, people are trying to feel better or solve this problem, and they say, we use this tree and we use this tree, and then we start having a conversation about, can we scale that up? Can we domesticate these trees? Can we at least start wild harvesting the ones that exist? So I think going back to basics and thinking about how do we harness knowledge that's already there? How do we work with local centers of knowledge? Because I also found a lot of research at local universities that had been researched and then put on a shelf somewhere and forgotten about. But going back to revisit that and say, what do we already have locally, and can we even meet a local demand with these trees?
Okay, thank you. So, Musa.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. And I want to raise some points on the ground. If you look at the Tree Seed Center at in Burkina Faso, we have 35 years old. And at the beginning, if you look at the demand on seeds, at the beginning we have exotic tree species are main demand. But nowadays, the main demands are focused on local food trees and medicine trees, and for energy too. We have this demand on the ground. And one of our challenges is how to, the seed system. We have a central and also at the regional level. But even it's not enough, because we have a rate of 10 or 15%. We made a kind of survey, and we found out that we have around 15% of our seed which are using at the local level. That means that we have a real problem to deliver good tree seeds to local communities on the ground. We are thinking, we're still thinking about how to promote, how to strengthen this delivery system at the local level. I think that I will.
Okay, thank you. So, Doug, would you like to?
Just a couple of points. Just listening to all of the presentations and all the speakers, we have a problem of connection. This is a general problem that we face in many sectors, many walks of life. But in this world of restoration and sustainable land use, I think it's still a very big issue, and it cuts across so many different levels and so many different institutional settings. And there are no easy solutions, but I think we need to recognize the problem first of all, and then we can start to find ways to improve on that. But it's a big problem. It's a big problem at all levels. Charles mentioned that even as development organizations assisting countries, we don't have our act together well enough. We tend to work in silos. Ministries tend to work in silos. So it's a big problem. And I think, you know, creating awareness of that issue is the first step. The science policy gap, which we've talked about for decades, it still exists. And we need to find good examples of where that gap is being closed. Not to embarrass my good friend, but I see that Chung Jae Lee, who's the president of NIFOS in South Korea, the National Institute of Forest Sciences, is here. And I think Korea, I know, has a long history of restoration. And I think they've worked out some of those issues of how science and policy can bridge that gap. But that's a key issue in many, many countries. We have networks that Mario's referred to on forest genetic resources that have been around for a long time in each region. Those are very important networks, but they tend to be a bit isolated. They tend to be scientists and genetic resource people talking to genetic resource people. How do we start to infiltrate more into other settings so that information, that knowledge can really start to be shared? So it's at so many different levels. We have intergovernmental processes that have been around. FAO hosts an intergovernmental body dealing with forest genetic resources that has come up with a global plan of action based on country reports for the past, 2014, this report, this State of the World report came out. There are documents that exist, processes that exist, but they don't really get shared well enough. So somehow connecting those dots, I think, is key. And if we simply try to look at, from our different perspectives, our different institutional perspectives, try to be more aware of where might I be able to connect, where are those gaps, and it's going to be a series of small solutions, no big solutions, but I see that as still a critical factor.
Okay, thanks. So, anything?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Christ.
Cameron.
Yes, we have a challenge, is to plant 14,000 hectares every year. So the solutions that are critical for us concerning strengthening the legal framework of the seed sector and the development of the national seed strategy, restoration and degraded landscape. And the critical solution concerning also the development of implementation of seed programs and projects and landscape restoration. And also the development of seed and silviculture value chain through the acquisition of amount, other things, technology, adequate infrastructure and equipment. And research and development and training and capacity building of the actors. And also, we think that it's important to involve a private sector in this process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So finally, Vanya.
Okay. So coming from my context on the ground, I would emphasize the importance of strengthening the capacities of local communities. Because from what I've seen, the knowledge of how to deal with trees is mostly centered in the older generation of the regions where I've worked. And the younger people have they have not so much interest, or they have lost the interest to learn about these things. So when knowledge is the barrier, to find a way to strengthen this knowledge intergenerationally. In the context of Mexico, I've seen in-government programs that the barrier is the certification, so maybe there the private sector could play an interesting role where they can help local communities that have their small initiatives to be able to make this into something bigger, scale it up in their communities without the bureaucracy that can be a barrier when you're dealing with government. And this is what I would emphasize.
Okay, thank you, Vanya. So first, I'd like to thank all our panelists at this stage for managing to keep so succinctly to the time they've managed with the very challenging topics that we're dealing with here. We still have 20 minutes left for an open forum that really I would like to open to the audience now to give interventions on. We've heard a lot about, first of all, the challenges, the issues, the terms of, we have 60,000 tree species on our planet. Probably 50% of those are under conservation status that we know nothing about. We're certainly losing species at a rapid rate. We know that there is local knowledge for many of these tree species, but we also know that there are hugely innovative opportunities in terms of linking the business sector with that diversity of tree species. So we've got a huge opportunity, and we need to develop those solutions working across both the business sector and the scientific community as well. So I'd like to open the floor now to really get some perspectives from the audience, and perhaps it would be really nice to start first with some of the youth representatives. So if there is any of the youth representatives in the audience, or anyone who was born after 1990 who would like to make a comment. Maybe we don't have anyone born after 1990. Yes? Yes, okay. If you could give your name and institutions.
Thank you very much. My name is Bramley. I am here with Rain Trust, but I come from the rainiest place on earth, if you know where that is. It's in the state of Meghalaya in northeast India. So I'm a mountain man who's fallen in love with the ocean. I've been working to restore cloud forests up in the eastern Himalayas. We have a big problem with deforestation, but our tribe is matrilineal and matriarchal, so we still have a sacred forest and sacred groves, but like a lady from Mexico said, the indigenous people or even the young people are moving to the cities looking for better opportunities. They do not learn from their elders, so they're forgetting. I used to go for walks with my father when I was younger to identify tree species in our sacred forest. We have like 500 species of trees and herbs in our medieval forest. Some still exist, but because of modernization, people don't care and they're cutting these sacred forests. But I think it's very important for young people to go and learn from the elders before they all die out, because there's nothing written, sadly. We know the native names, but we might not know the biological name. They would collect those seeds and put them. We have 75 varieties of rice that grow in the mountain that are drought resilient, but people don't eat them anymore, so then there's other rice that comes. It's very cheap and it's sad. But I think it's very important for young people to go back to nature and work in regenerative agriculture with local farmers and connect ecosystems. And I was wondering if there anyone here involved with payment for ecosystem services that rewards these small-hole organic farmers in the mountains for their services to the downstream people to prevent erosion and topsoil depletion and flash floods. So downstream people pay upstream people through the river system. I'm just wondering if there are any stories like that, and to protect seeds and to share this knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that intervention. Would anyone like to respond from Anesse?
But it's not a response for his word. I forgot something
okay.
concerning the solutions that are proposed by biodiversity. Only to say that they are relevant, but must be aligned with national priorities. That's very important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, okay.
So in Mexico, we do have two examples that I know regarding payment for ecosystem services at a basin level. And so the first one is done when the government charges for water, they charge an extra peso, so it's very, very little. And this peso goes into payment for ecosystem services on the top side of the basin, with the idea that the trees that are there are providing the water for the lower part. And then another example is, again, in a mountainous region, the people on top of the mountain are paid to keep the forest, because otherwise the erosion causes sedimentation, and the lower part that is very, very important for agriculture. So the private sector of agriculture pays the lower part of the mountain so that they can still do agriculture down there without erosion problems coming from the top.
I think the issue of employment is a really critical issue, especially youth employment and looking at gender-sensitive employment as well. And I think that's one of the areas where we really have huge opportunities as well, and particularly in the scaling up of delivery of diversity, the infrastructure and the employment that is needed to address scaling up and not only collecting of seed, but propagation in nurseries and maintaining that material. As Ramli alluded to, something like 30% of tropical trees are recalcitrant. That means we cannot store those seeds months or years at a time and then bring them out. We have to be doing this as a continual process. So there are huge employment opportunities there to use that diversity, which needs to be used quickly before we lose it, and also in terms of being able to capture when species are actually producing fruit, which in many tropical trees isn't every year. So we need to have a big workforce in place to be able to both monitor and do the collection. I'd like to open to any other issues really related to this employment issue. I think is a really important one. But if you, you have a question here. If it's, we have the microphone brought down.
Yes.
Someone has it already.
She's got it there.
Okay. She was had her hand. So okay, I'll go to her next. Okay.
Good morning. Aileen Mairena from the Indigenous People Major Group. I come from Nicaragua and indigenous from Miskito Indigenous from the Atlantic Coast. I was hearing there is a lot of good experience, interesting for us, but we think about the issues that is very important is the land the tenure, the land security of our territories. Sure. Because if we don't have the land security, all right, so we have this movement to cities, we have the loss of indigenous knowledge. So we think that this is one of the most important things for us. We need now land security on our territories so we can develop some process. And there is in Latin America, at least in Nicaragua, some experience with indigenous people and youth people that we're trying to develop or reinforce this link between the knowledge of our elders with the youth in our communities. And we have some interesting activities going on in the basin of the Miskito Rio Huanqui, that is the river, that is Coco River, but we call it Huanqui. So I think some of all these institutions, sometimes I have to say, is a critic, a positive, because we can move on that. Sometimes they develop all this process up, but they don't see what we are doing. We are doing things. It's true that in some indigenous territories there is a loss of knowledge, but there are other interesting activities that we are doing that could be good to look and develop most of your work from the bottom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that? Doug, yeah?
Maybe just in general, this question about employment, about keeping people on the land, it's critical. And I think one of the key ways that that's going to happen more and more is through the development and reinforcement of value chains. There has to be a reason why youth and others would want to stay rather than leave and search opportunities elsewhere where there may not be anything locally. So, and this is why I think it's important to have people like Doreen on the panel, because this is where we need to be providing support that's complementary to sort of the technical interventions. Again, we tend to come in through our silo vision, and we talk about a restoration project, and so what's needed in terms of policy and technologies for restoration. We also need to be looking at how do we develop the skill sets in local communities so that people can become better entrepreneurs. They have business skills, they have accounting skills, organizational skills, in addition to knowing how to set up and run nurseries. And those are the things that, again, I think we need to connect more effectively on. So as we develop interventions with government, with local communities, with external institutions like ours and donors, we need to start thinking about how we have a more comprehensive and integrated approach. It's easier said than done, but we still tend to be too siloistic. So I think that push on economic opportunities that will be the motor for not only restoration, but for sustainable management of these areas. a big issue that we sort of don't really address when we talk about restoration is, why is there degradation to begin with? What are the drivers that led to that degraded state of land? And unless we really start to look at those drivers in conjunction with the restoration, we might just be, you know, continuing the same pattern. So those sustainable technologies, sustainable land management technologies, which I think often will be based in economic realities, are ones that need to be simultaneously pursued.
Okay, thanks, Doug. I think we had a question at the front here that I apparently missed. On the back. Okay. Okay. Up here. Yes. Lady with the hand up at the back. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm born after 90s, so after 1990. I don't know if that makes me very representative of the youth, but I try to share my experience. I'm from Belgium, but I was doing my master thesis a few months ago in Peru, doing research about agroforestry systems and the socioeconomic drivers to diversity. And I just want to share some interesting things I've observed on the field there when I was talking with farmers about diversity and about what would drive them to plant certain species or not. And what I heard a lot when I would talk to them about why do you have these or that species, why don't you plant that, it seems to have this huge opportunity on the market. They would have this very interesting reaction, which was that they were kind of fed up with people coming to them and telling them, you should plant this, it has a huge market, or it might have an interesting market in the future. And as we're speaking about like economic opportunities and linking the market, like value chains, I think we also have to be very careful about what we communicate to farmers. Because I've seen farmers who've planted a lot of certain species which were thought to have this huge opportunity or this huge market a few years from then, and who a few years later were left with that huge production and no market. So that happened with like a copoaçu crop, which is like a relative to cacao that they have in the region, which now is just, they have these rotten fruits which are very interesting and which have a lot of interesting benefits, but no market yet. It happened with sachainchi, which is used to produce some oil, which was also planted very much and now left on the fields because there is no value chain for that. So I think it's, of course, very important to link producers with the market, and I think that's how we can motivate farmers to have more diversity on the fields, because they know the diversity, but another thing is how to, yes, have a use of this. But we have to be very careful when we give these advices and talk about things that are already, what is already a demand. And I very much related with, I can't remember the name, but one of the speakers from Zimbabwe, I think, who talked about the fact that the wellness kind of demand now is growing. And I think this is very interesting, and also from what I observed in Peru, is that there are all these plants which have a lot of medical properties, and there is already a demand for that. And the interesting aspect is that they can be preserved a lot longer. So the problem is also that often fruits, they get moldy, so we like to talk about food because food security for farmers, we like to think that this could connect with the rest of more global markets, but I think there's also a difference to make between the crops that farmers would grow for themselves, and they already do this. They have like very diverse gardens where they have a lot of different fruits produced for themselves, but then the question is more, what do we want them to produce for exportation? And for now, they're just using these crops that there is a market for, so cacao, but they're having these big monocultures. And I think there is a big interest in a lot of different trees. The region that I did my research in, they have, for example, all these trees that produce very interesting essential oils, very interesting butter, and all that can be used and can be exported and can produce very diverse producing systems.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. I think it hits a really important point that we not only need resilient supply, we need really resilient demand if we want to develop markets for these different commodities. And this is why there needs to be a really strong linkage between the private sector. A project that we recently have been running in Peru as well with a Swiss supermarket chain, Co-op, which is actually looking at this issue, trying to develop sustainable demand as well as supply for diversified products. I think this is a really important point. Yep. Yes, Ramli, very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. That was really nice comment from the youth lady. But I also just wanted to say, you know, there's sometimes in some regions, it's very context specific. There is a lack of awareness of the value of some of these tree foods, for example, and their nutritional value and how important they are. And it is on really people, researchers, scientists, or the ones who implement that knowledge downstream to make people aware that it's not only about dollar value, it's also about health value.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point to make. And we're only just starting to learn the nutritional value of many of these species as well, and their medicinal value. So I think we have I'm going to try and take two more questions. The gentleman at the back with his hand up here, and then the gentleman at the back there. Okay. And then one more. If there's one more lady, then okay, one more. Okay, yep.
All right, my name is Ibrahim Abdullahi. I'm a Nigerian, but I live in the United Kingdom as a PhD student with Bangor University. My question will lead to my fellow brothers there, or do I say uncle? I've heard a lot about Burkina Faso, especially on your seed project. It's quite interesting. But one of the biggest challenges we have, especially in West Africa, is we tend to have this zeal that, hey, we need to plant 10,000 species in the next 5 years. We need to plant 1 million species in the next 10 years.
Yes.
I've been in the field as a PhD student. I've asked questions, and it seems that there is this lack of connection between the land tenure system in Africa and the socio-cultural values of the people. I'm trying to be specific here, especially in terms of this context. I come from Nigeria, the north central part, where I try to ask this question of how do you accept trees planted on your farm, for instance? And the responses were, yes, it's okay, we would accept it, especially when it concerns something that will support our wives, maybe for firewood or fruits or something like that. And I was like, okay, what if it's for climate change or for environmental services? They don't see that. They see more of an economic thing than an environmental thing.
Okay.
But just 1 minute, please.
We haven't got time because we want to give other people time for questions. You really make your point in the last sentence.
The point is this. Until the leadership connects the land tenure system with the social cultural value of the people, the restoration of having 10,000 species on 1 hectare of land, for instance, in the next 5 years is still a dream.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So at the back, yes, you can please try and keep it short question because we're running out of time.
Yeah, Alban Kisife is my name. I'm from the International Climate Initiative of the Ministry for the Environment here in Germany. My question has to do with the land tenure, and I would like to just buttress the fact mentioned by the colleague from Nicaragua. Restoration as such, especially in the African context where the government de facto is the sole owner of land, it's a little bit tricky because getting people to plant trees, especially native species that take longer periods of growth, is then challenging because it looks like at the end of the day, if I have the trees on my area, then the government actually can easily get back this land because my user rights are then much more limited because I have so much more value, which is from the government's perspective much more interesting. So it is difficult to actually get farmers to plant tree species that are not fast growing, where they can get immediately the turnouts from the tree species if compared to actually native species that are lengthy, that have lengthy growth periods.
Okay. thanks. Yeah, I think we the point that we need to have a good understanding of the temporal benefits delivery of different diversity, and I think we're only beginning to understand what's the real potential for much diversity to have different rapid returns as well. So thanks. I'm afraid we really are running out of time for additional questions, and I think everyone will want to go for coffee. So I'd really like to ask Eric Fernandez from the World Bank, who's a senior advisor in forest and agriculture, to come and give a few closing remarks to the session. I think it's been heartening to see that people are attending, a fantastic panel, but that we've got so many people in the room for actually a topic that probably 5 years ago would have attracted no attention at all. And I think it emphasizes how important this is for scaling up and delivery of restoration objectives. So I'd like to ask Eric to come to the floor, please.
Thank you very much. This is indeed a privilege to be here. It's been fascinating experiencing the cultures, the diversity, the age classifications that we see in the room. And I know we are connected to the world. Acknowledgement and shout out to all our colleagues in the middle of the night, wherever you are, who are listening to this. So it's not just us in this room. We have a lot of people listening, hearing, thinking about what we're saying. It's a daunting task to try and provide some closing remarks, but I heard some very interesting messages, I think, that are worth repeating. I should say I'm Kenyan, and I've just seen a colleague that I haven't seen for decades who's Brazilian. Milton, can you stand up, please, so that people can see you? Milton is Brazilian, and I'm Kenyan. That figures, right? This diversity is everywhere. Don't sort of be fooled by what you see. We may look old, but we're still young. We heard about landscapes. We heard about the desire to restore. It means that change is here. Change has been happening for decades, if not centuries. We heard about forests. We heard about land. We didn't hear about water mentioned a lot, but you know what I'm saying. It's important. We heard about biodiversity. We heard about ecosystem services. And we heard about people, whether it's our colleague from indigenous communities in Nicaragua, colleagues from all the countries. We heard about people. So these are components of a landscape. And we risk missing the point if we don't have that in the back of our minds. So let's keep that. It's not just about forests, it's not just about trees. I'll come back to that. We heard about change, whether it's climate, whether it's other human-driven change factors. We heard about challenges, but every time there's a challenge, there are opportunities. My dad used to say to me, why are you trying to fix something that's not broken? Where there are challenges, there are opportunities, okay? The big challenge that we have, there are many, but three that we in the bank face, and I should say in the World Bank, we try and work very closely with our country colleagues. We try and work multi-discipline, multi-sectoral, even though we are organized both in the bank and in our governments along sectoral lines. The trick is, how do you bring this diverse knowledge, the policies, the instruments, the solutions, and integrate them to resolve issues that the challenges present? I think that's a really important one. The other thing that's happening, we heard about climate, it's here. I mean, whatever people try and argue that it's not happening, you all know. I don't have to preach to you folks. But what's really daunting is the speed at which it's happening, okay? And I don't think we appreciate just how fast this changes. Now, there's one thing, before I forget to mention it, that just recently got a lot of news. We're talking about seeds and the ability to provide planting material. A lot of the seeds depend on one very important process in nature. What's that? Pollination. Have you heard about the insect apocalypse? I mean, follow that story. New York Times had a very interesting article on that. We have a problem, folks. If our insects collapse, then if you think you've got challenges now, you haven't seen anything yet. So watch that. And that leads me to the next point. So in the opportunity, keep the landscape production and ecosystem services at the same level. I would put ecosystem services at a higher level in terms of value. We heard about payments for ecosystem services. That's a drop in the bucket compared to our global markets for commodities. We seem to have our priorities inverted, okay? So in your landscape approach to restoration, always keep in mind the ecosystem services. You know, there's a lot here. I'm out of time, but the final, I mean, you know, we talk about all these efforts, and we talk about markets. We talk about people earning something so that they can live better. If we can make sure that people earn a decent livelihood and a standard of living within the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, this is one way, this is one opportunity, I think, in the landscapes restoration efforts that all of us have to try and keep that very firmly in mind. If I have a decent livelihood where I live, why would I want to cross the Sahara Desert to end up in a slave camp somewhere or in a slum in another country? Doesn't make sense, okay? So let's value those services and help our communities where they live. Finally, some of you are going to the COP, the Conference of the Parties meeting, okay? We're not going to make 2 degrees centigrade. I mean, for all our pious words, we're not. So let's get ready to rumble, as they say. Let's get ready. Believe in your commitment. You have a strong commitment. All of you here, you are here for a reason. You've traveled many, many, many kilometers and miles to get here. You've crossed snowy landscapes as you get here. Be ambitious, because even if you fail big, okay? Yeah, don't be frightened to fail, but fail big if you're going to fail, okay? That's a message from our president in the bank, Mr. Jim Kim. He always said, you know, instead of doing 200,000, antiretrovirals in a certain health program, because he's a medical doctor, he argued for 1,500,000. And he said, I failed, but we got 1 million. You know, that's the way you deal with it. So finally, just try and integrate the work that you do. Everybody's important. We talk about trees, but it's the vegetation, it's plants. 300,000 plant species, 20 of them provide 90% of our food. Humanity depends on 3 grasses and 2 roots. Go figure. We have a problem, okay? So let's be integrative. Let's value cultures. Let's value local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and let's put science to help us. Because science reveals something that many of our intergenerational knowledge toolkits don't cope with. Climate change is one of them. And this is one of the key things you'll hear, even when you talk with our indigenous community, they said, nothing seems to work anymore, okay? And use that science to build on indigenous communities. Finally, that last example, did you hear of that discovery recently from Mexico in Oaxaca? This community that had preserved a maize variety that collaborates with a bacterium from the soil, I'm calling it a bacterium, but a soil microorganisms to fix its own nitrogen. This is hundreds of years old. We just discovered it now. Why is that important? Because nitrogen is the godfather of pollution on the planet, okay? It's everywhere, but you don't see it. So if we can fix this using indigenous knowledge, using good science, sharing the benefits, the Mexican communities that saved this particular maize variety have now developed a benefit-sharing mechanisms, because if this process is industrialized, they will get some money and they will get some benefits from it. So this sharing of benefits, sharing of traditional knowledge, sharing of science for the benefit of humanity is what I hear from all of you. Thank you very much for this privilege.
Thank you very much, Eric, for those closing remarks. I'd just like, before everyone leaves, to thank everyone for staying the extra 5 minutes. The session went over, but particularly to give a warm thanks to all of our excellent panelists for their contribution to the discussion this morning. I hope you all go away realizing that we've got a huge challenge to planting 1 trillion trees, but it's not any trees, it's the trees that are going to deliver multiple sustainable development goals. And we have a huge opportunity to use the Earth's biodiversity to make that happen. So thank you, everyone, for your contribution, and thank you, all of the panelists.